Commander Xira stood alone in the wreckage of her ship, her claws gripping the twisted metal as she surveyed the dense alien jungle around her. Smoke rose from the shattered remains of her vessel, the only sign of civilization on this hostile, unknown world. The sky above was painted in streaks of violet and black, the twin suns barely breaking through the thick, storm-ridden clouds. Xira took a slow breath, her body aching from the crash, but she knew one thing for certain: she would survive. She always survived. She was Railzek, the last true Deathworlder in a galaxy filled with weak, fragile species who could not imagine the horrors she had endured. From the moment she was born, she had been forged in pain, raised in an environment where only the strongest live. The universe feared her kind, but she no longer had a kind. She was the last. She moved carefully through the jungle, her senses sharp, scanning for danger. The trees towered above her, their twisted branches moving unnaturally, as if alive. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting slightly with every step, like a creature waiting to swallow her whole. She could hear distant sounds: low growls, rustling leaves, the sharp hiss of something unseen. This planet was hostile, dangerous, and completely unknown. It was exactly the kind of place she had been built to endure. She didn't fear the predators lurking in the darkness. If they came for her, she would tear them apart. Then something unexpected happened. A voice. A sound so out of place that, for a moment, she thought she had imagined it. It was faint, carried by the wind, but unmistakably real. Words spoken in a language she recognized. Not the guttural snarls of a beast, nor the clicking tones of an unknown alien species. It was clear, precise. It was human. Xira's muscles tensed as she turned in the direction of the sound. A human? Here? No, it wasn't possible. She had fought against their kind before, had seen their soldiers on the battlefield. Humans were tough, more than most species, but they were not Deathworlders. They were not like her. And yet, the voice she had heard carried a confidence, a certainty that no ordinary being would have on a planet like this. It intrigued her, even as her instincts warned her to stay cautious. She moved silently, her body blending into the shadows as she made her way through the thick foliage. The voice became clearer. A man's voice. His tone was calm, but there was strain in it: injury, exhaustion, but not fear. Xira narrowed her eyes as she reached a clearing, her gaze locking onto the source. There, sitting against the trunk of a massive, gnarled tree, was a human. His clothing was torn, his left arm wrapped in blood-stained fabric, and his face smeared with dirt. But despite the clear signs of struggle, he wasn't cowering. He wasn't panicking. He was sharpening a jagged piece of metal with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes scanning the area like a predator waiting for its prey to show itself. He wasn't just surviving. He was planning. Xira remained in the shadows, watching him, assessing. Most species would have already succumbed to this planet's merciless nature, but this man, this human, had lasted long enough to establish a pattern, to gather resources, to think ahead. That was rare. That was familiar. She stepped forward, her presence no longer hidden. The human's head snapped up instantly, his muscles coiling like a spring ready to strike. His hand tightened around his makeshift blade, his eyes locking onto hers. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged, filled with an understanding neither had expected to find. Then, finally, he exhaled and tilted his head slightly, a small, knowing smile appearing on his lips. "Well," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "Took you long enough." Xira's claws flexed at his words, more from curiosity than aggression. He wasn't afraid of her. That alone made him different from every other being she had encountered in the galaxy. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of command, expecting submission. The human chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Captain David Carter, Terran Expeditionary Forces. Crashed here 2 weeks ago." He gestured at the wreckage in the distance. "Looks like you had a rough landing yourself." Xira didn't respond immediately. She had assumed she was alone in this universe, the only one capable of surviving what weaker species could not. But this human had lasted weeks on a death world, injured, alone, and yet still standing. That was no accident. That was willpower. That was strength. She took another step forward, her eyes locked onto his, studying, searching. "You're not like the others," she said finally. "You shouldn't have lasted this long." David smirked, his grip on the weapon relaxing just slightly. "Funny," he said. "I was thinking the same about you." For the first time in years, Zira felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not hostility, something else. Something she hadn't known she needed until this moment. Recognition. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the last after all. The jungle was alive with whispers of unseen creatures, their movements barely audible beneath the thick, humid air. Massive trees twisted into the sky, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers, blocking out the weak light that tried to pierce through the darkness. Zira moved silently, her keen eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Every step she took was calculated, her senses sharp, her instincts screaming that she was not alone. This planet was not just dangerous, it was hunting her. And yet, something else lurked in the depths of this wilderness, something that didn't belong. Something that had spoken to her in a voice far too calm for a place like this. A human. Her claws flexed slightly as she pushed forward, her breath controlled, every movement precise. The jungle around her was full of life, but none of it felt real. Everything was too still, too measured, as if waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blood, the remains of some unfortunate creature torn apart in the distance. Zira had seen countless predators in her lifetime, but there was something different about this place. It wasn't just filled with mindless beasts, it was filled with killers who knew how to wait. And yet, the human had survived. She had watched him from the shadows, studying the way he moved, the way he reacted to the environment. He was injured, but his body language was steady, his posture ready for attack at any moment. He wasn't just enduring this place, he was adapting. Zira had always believed humans were stronger than most species, but they were still nothing compared to her kind. They weren't Deathworlders. They weren't like her. But now, as she followed him through the jungle, unseen and unheard, she began to wonder. The man David, he had called himself, was moving through the undergrowth with surprising efficiency. He was slower than her, but not by much. His muscles were tense, his grip firm on the jagged piece of metal he had sharpened into a weapon. He wasn't blindly running or hiding. He was hunting. Zira had expected fear. She had expected desperation. But there was none. Instead, he looked like a creature of instinct, calculating, waiting for something to strike first. Then, without warning, the jungle exploded into motion. A massive creature lunged from the darkness, its thick, reptilian body covered in jagged black scales that absorbed the light. Its rows of needle-like teeth snapped inches from David's head as he ducked, rolling to the side in a blur of motion. Zira watched from the shadows as the human reacted with terrifying speed, his hands moving before his mind could think, his weapon flashing in the dim light. The makeshift blade plunged deep into the creature's side, and instead of retreating, David pushed forward, driving it in further with a force that sent shockwaves through the beast's massive form. The predator screeched in rage, thrashing violently, its powerful tail sweeping across the ground. David jumped back just in time to avoid being crushed, his breathing controlled, his stance shifting. He was bleeding, but his expression remained unreadable, his focus locked onto the creature as it circled him, its glowing yellow eyes burning with fury. Zira knew she could intervene. She could end this fight in seconds. But she didn't move. She wanted to see what would happen next. The beast roared, lunging again, but David was ready. He twisted his body, sidestepping with perfect timing, using the predator's own momentum against it. His movements weren't reckless, they were precise, deliberate, like someone who had spent his entire life surviving. In one swift motion, he drove his weapon into the creature's throat, twisting hard. A sickening crunch echoed through the jungle, and the beast staggered, its massive form crashing to the ground, unmoving. Silence fell over the jungle once more, but Zira wasn't looking at the fallen predator. She was looking at the human. David exhaled slowly, wiping the blood from his face with the back of his hand. His eyes flickered toward the shadows, his expression unreadable. He knew. "You're watching me," he said, his voice calm despite the battle he had just fought. He didn't look afraid. He didn't even seem surprised. He simply turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the darkness where Xera stood. "Are you gonna come out, or do you just enjoy the show?" For the first time in her life, Xera felt something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even amusement. It was something else. Something dangerous. She stepped forward, no longer bothering to hide her presence. The human turned fully to face her, his expression unreadable, his grip still firm on his weapon. But he didn't raise it. He didn't move into a defensive stance. Instead, he smirked. "Well," he said, his voice filled with something she hadn't expected. "Looks like I'm not the only predator on this planet." Xera's claws flexed, but not in hostility. The air between them was charged, filled with unspoken understanding. She'd thought she was the only one, the only being capable of surviving the horrors of a death world. But now, as she stood in front of this human, she realized she had been wrong. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only predator in the dark. The alien battlefield was a graveyard of burning wreckage and bodies, the air thick with the stench of smoke and death. Explosions rumbled in the distance, shaking the broken terrain as the war continued without mercy. Blood and oil soaked the ground beneath the dying light of a red sun. The galaxy had long believed that humans were just another species to be conquered, another weak race that would break under pressure. But the enemy had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the resilience of a Deathworlder. And now, the last man standing on this forsaken battlefield was proving exactly why that mistake would cost them everything. Sergeant Daniel Reeve forced himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. His body was battered, his armor cracked, and blood dripped from a deep gash above his eye, blurring his vision. But he was alive. His squad was gone, wiped out in the first wave of the ambush, their bodies now lying motionless in the dust. The enemy had assumed he was dead too. That was their second mistake. He gritted his teeth as he scanned the ruins around him. The battlefield stretched for miles, a wasteland of destruction where only the strongest could still stand. And standing in the distance, emerging from the smoke like specters of death, were the enemy, the Exalari, towering reptilian warriors with thick, armored scales and razor-sharp claws. They were designed for war, built to rip apart lesser beings. And yet, they had never fought a human who refused to die. Daniel took a slow breath, adjusting his grip on his rifle. The energy cell was nearly drained, his ammo running dangerously low. His knife was still strapped to his chest, the last weapon he could trust if things got too close. The Exalari moved cautiously, their glowing eyes scanning for any sign of life among the corpses. They thought the fight was already over. That was their third mistake. With a sudden burst of movement, Daniel surged forward. The first Exalari barely had time to react before he was on it, his blade sinking deep into the creature's neck. It let out a gurgled snarl as it staggered back, claws swiping wildly. Daniel ducked low, ripping the knife free in one smooth motion before driving it into the beast's chest. The Exalari collapsed with a heavy thud, its lifeless eyes staring at the sky. The others roared in fury, their shock quickly turning to aggression. 3 more charged at him, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen alien's rifle, rolling to the side just as the first set of claws slashed through the air where he had been standing. He fired without thinking, sending a blast of searing plasma straight into the lead Exalari's skull. The beast dropped instantly, smoke rising from the smoldering hole where its face had been. The last 2 hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Daniel lunged at the nearest one, ramming his shoulder into its gut and forcing it backward. They crashed into a pile of wreckage, metal and debris scattering around them. The alien thrashed, its claws slicing across his arm, but Daniel didn't feel the pain. Not yet. He was already moving, already reacting. His knife found its mark again, buried deep between the creature's ribs. The final Exalari, the last one standing, stared at him with something almost like fear. Daniel could see it in its posture, in the way it shifted its weight slightly backward. It had never seen something like this before. It had never fought something that refused to fall. Daniel wiped the blood from his mouth and took a slow step forward. "Come on," he muttered, his voice rough, his breathing heavy. "Let's see if you're as tough as you think." The Exilari let out a guttural snarl and charged. Daniel waited until the last second before sidestepping, his knife flashing upward, catching the alien's exposed throat in one precise strike. The beast choked on its own blood as it staggered, collapsing to its knees before finally falling motionless. Silence settled over the battlefield. Daniel exhaled, his vision swimming, his body finally registering the damage it had taken. He knew he should stop. He knew he needed medical attention. But he also knew something else. He wasn't dead yet, and Deathworlders don't die easy. The ruins of the city stretched endlessly beneath the burning sky, shattered towers standing like the broken ribs of a dead giant. Smoke rose from the wreckage, the air thick with the scent of fire and blood. The war had raged for weeks, and the enemy had believed this was the final battle. They had thought that by now, humanity would have fallen. They had expected surrender. But the enemy had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the ones who refused to break. Captain Elias Kane moved through the rubble, his breath steady despite the chaos around him. His armor was cracked, stained with dust and blood, but his hands were firm on his rifle. His squad was down to 5, their numbers dwindling with every brutal assault, yet they still stood, still moved forward, still fought. The enemy had called them weak, had laughed at the thought of a species from a so-called low-tier world standing against the might of the galactic dominion. But now, the laughter had stopped. Blaster fire tore through the silence, cutting across the broken landscape. Elias barely had time to dive behind a slab of fallen concrete before the explosion sent debris flying. The enemy was regrouping, pushing forward, believing they had the advantage. He could hear their guttural voices, their heavy footfalls echoing against the ruins. Massive figures in dark armor, Trinari shock troops, brutal and efficient killers spread out, their glowing visors scanning for survivors. They thought they had won. Elias exchanged a glance with Sergeant Cole, who crouched beside him, gripping his weapon with grim determination. The others, Rise, Dax, and Carter, were positioned along the debris field, waiting for the right moment. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but none of them looked afraid. They had survived too much to stop now. Elias took a slow breath, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. They weren't just survivors. They weren't just soldiers. They were human. And humans didn't stop. A Trinari soldier stepped closer, his weapon raised. He barely had time to react before Elias moved. In a blur of motion, Elias surged from cover, his rifle spitting fire. The first shot took the alien in the chest, sending him staggering, but Elias didn't stop. He pressed forward, dodging to the side as another Trinari fired, the plasma blast searing past his shoulder. Cole took down the second enemy with a clean shot to the head, while Rise and Dax flanked from the sides, their movements swift and relentless. The enemy hesitated. They weren't used to this. They had fought countless wars, crushed rebellions, wiped out civilizations with ease. But this was different. These humans were outnumbered, wounded, pushed to the brink of exhaustion. And yet, they kept coming. They didn't hesitate. They didn't slow down. Carter dropped from above, landing behind the remaining soldiers, her combat knife flashing as she cut through the nearest one's throat. The last Trinari barely had time to turn before Elias ended him with a precise shot between the eyes. And then, silence. The humans stood among the bodies, breathing heavily, scanning the ruins for more threats. Blood dripped from Elias's arm, but he ignored the pain. Pain didn't matter. Fear didn't matter. Only survival. Only the mission. Dax let out a rough chuckle, wiping the sweat from his face. They really don't learn, do they? Reyes shook his head, reloading his weapon. They think we're like them. That we break. Cole smirked, kicking one of the fallen Trinari aside. They don't get it. We don't stop. Elias looked toward the horizon, where enemy reinforcements were gathering. More would come. They always did. But the humans would still be here, still standing, still fighting, because they weren't just another species to be conquered. They were something different, something unstoppable. And as long as one of them still drew breath, the war would never be over. The battlefield was silent now, except for the distant crackling of flames and the occasional groan of metal shifting under the weight of destruction. Smoke hung in the air like a thick fog, obscuring the stars above. Beneath the wreckage of fallen ships and broken bodies, Captain Roran Hayes pushed himself up, gasping for breath. His body ached, his armor was scorched, and blood dripped from a gash above his eye, but he was alive. That was more than he could say for most of the soldiers who had fought beside him. The enemy had believed they had wiped out the last human resistance on this planet. They had believed victory was certain, but they had made a mistake, one they would soon regret. Roran wiped the blood from his face, scanning the ruins for any signs of life. The once great city of Veloria was nothing more than rubble, its towering spires reduced to jagged skeletons of stone and steel. The enemy had been thorough in their destruction, leaving no corner untouched. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't be the only one left. There had to be others. He staggered forward, gripping his side where the pain was sharpest. His rifle was gone, buried somewhere beneath the debris, but his knife was still strapped to his chest. It would have to do. A low growl echoed from the shadows ahead, and Roran's grip tightened around the hilt of his blade. The enemy was still here. The Draxian hunters, massive creatures with armor like scales and glowing red eyes, moved through the ruins, searching for survivors to eliminate. One of them stepped into view, its tall reptilian frame illuminated by the distant fires. It hadn't seen him yet. Roran took a slow breath, forcing his body to move despite the pain. He was outmatched, but that had never stopped him before. He lunged from the shadows, moving faster than the Draxian expected. His blade found its mark, slicing deep into the creature's exposed throat. It let out a choked snarl, claws swiping blindly as it staggered back. Roran twisted the knife, then yanked it free, letting the alien collapse at his feet. He barely had time to recover before another one spotted him. This time, he had no chance to strike first. The Draxian moved with inhuman speed, slamming into him and sending him crashing against a pile of debris. Stars exploded in his vision as the alien's claws raked across his chest, tearing through what little armor he had left. But Roran had fought worse. He rolled with the impact, using the momentum to twist free. Before the Draxian could react, he drove his knife upward, straight into the soft spot beneath its jaw. The creature gurgled, its red eyes flickering as it crumpled lifelessly. Roran pushed the body aside and forced himself to his feet. He had to keep moving. A flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. He wasn't alone. A small group of survivors, humans, battle-worn and bloodied, were emerging from the ruins. Their faces were grim, their weapons low, but their eyes burned with the same fire that kept Roran standing. They weren't finished yet. And neither was HE.1 of them. A woman with a deep scar running down her cheek stepped forward. "We thought we were the last ones." Roran shook his head. "Not yet. But we don't have much time. The Draxians will be back." A younger soldier, barely out of his teens, tightened his grip on his weapon. "Then we fight." Roran nodded. There was no other choice. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and wounded. But none of that mattered. Humanity had always survived against impossible odds. Not because of superior technology or sheer numbers, but because they refused to give up. Because they turned every loss into a lesson and every battle into a legend. As the group prepared to move, Roran felt something shift deep inside him. The war wasn't over. Not yet. And as long as there was breath in his lungs and strength in his hands, it never would be. Today, they were just survivors. But tomorrow, their story would be the beginning of something greater. A new legend was about to begin.